The information processing model can also be called an indirect processing model because in order for the performer or person participating in the movement, in order for them to perceive and use certain stimuli in the environment, stimuli must first be processed by the central nervous system. This was first created in 1868 by a Dutch physician under the name of Donders. It was later advanced even further in 1969 by Sternberg, who discovered that sensory information from the environment, which would be anything affecting the body's five senses, as well as internally, meaning anything coming from within our bodies, is processed in different stages within the central nervous system. There are two models of the information processing model. The first would be the black box system, which we see a picture of down below. This tells us that the sensory information is being input into the higher centers of the central nervous system and then output as the desired function of the body. This is a simple explanation of what happens. The second model is what is known as the information processing model and goes a bit more in depth than the black model does. It starts with the same sensory information being input into a person's central nervous system, but differentiates the steps that take place inside the high centers. The first of which is stimulus fortification, the second being response selection, and the third being response programming. Finally, the stimuli goes to the final output of the desired action and or adjustment of the action. The stimulus fortification is when the stimulus is identified and distinguished in the surrounding environment. The response selection stage is when your central nervous system formulates the appropriate response to the stimuli that has entered the system. And the response programming stage is when your body determines how to produce the desired response. This sounds like a long process, but in reality, this can occur very, very quickly. An example would be playing dodgeball. You see a ball coming towards you, and almost immediately you can decide whether to move out of the way or in what direction you would need to move in order to not get hit by the ball. Ecological perspective model or perspective approach. This is another model that attempts to provide an explanation of how the brain processes stimuli. It was advanced back in 1966 by a J.J. Gibson. Some people also call this approach a direct perception model due to the fact that it proposes that stimuli is directly used by the perceptual motor system, without having to go through any extensive processing through different and separate stages in the central nervous system, such as in the information processing model. Gibson's main argument was that any stimuli received by the body or brain already contained any information that was needed, and so it did not require the central nervous system to process it any further. All of the necessary information was already there and well known. An example of this could be smelling a food and already inherently knowing what it tastes like, or seeing steam rising off of a plate of food and knowing that it is hot without having to process that knowledge. It's already inherently known. The next theory is the motor program theory, and it's perhaps one of the most popular theories. The main point of this theory is focused on the efferent signal sent to the muscles in your body, essentially making it an open loop theory, which we will go over more in depth towards the end of this video. This theory was designed by Richard A. Schmidt, but was modified in the year 1968 by Kiel. His version of this theory stated that there are sets of muscle commands that allow a sequence to be carried out without influence by any peripheral feedback. Kiel's version is one of many, of which there are a large number of variations, but his main idea was that there was some sort of set of muscle commands, and this has, for the most part, stayed intact and been accepted by many scholars. Schmidt debated largely over the two types of commands that process through the motor program, which would be variant and invariant. The difference between them being that the variant command refer to characteristics of movement that can be altered when variations of a movement are attempted by the body. On the other end, we have the invariant commands, which refer to characteristics of movement that are persistent and unaltered regardless of any changes or variations that are made to the movement itself. An example of this would be skipping rocks on a lake. Although you can skip a rock on a lake surface by throwing it a certain way, you may need to alter the way in which you throw it slightly depending on the rock's size and or shape. This is different in the sense that the information processing model needs to process all information and does not have one already programmed schema with slight variations that your body readily accepts. The next theory is actually the equilibrium point hypothesis. The equilibrium point hypothesis was developed by Anatol Feldman in what is known as the Soviet Union. This hypothesis states that the body's motor system is not always programming the new levels of force needed to create movement, but that the body's motor system actually controls the threshold of activation of the motor neurons that innervate the muscles. This means that in order for the body and mind to create any movement, the equilibrium point hypothesis states that the threshold of activation is reduced so that your brain will create and use more motor neurons, which will therefore increase the contractile force of the muscle. Movement is in turn then controlled by an alteration of your body's motor neuron activation. Essentially, this is meaning that your limbs and muscles move due to relative changes of tension, which are caused by your agonist and antagonist muscles. This hypothesis is similar to the information processing model in the sense that it requires feedback, whether internal or external, in order to make the correct adjustments so that you may achieve your desired result of the movement. An example of this would be in the picture we see that the young woman is holding a band, which will create a different force than if she were to do any movements without the band, which in turn is changing the threshold of activation in order to create movement. The next theory is the dynamic pattern theory. This focuses on issues that are related to the coordination of two or more components within a person's motor system. These can be issues within the person's joints, muscles, neurons, etc., any part of the body. The dynamic pattern theory is based on the principles of nonlinear dynamics, which is more typically used in fields such as physics and mathematics. So this is also referred to as the chaos theory at times and within those fields. To better understand this theory, let's first define nonlinear dynamics. Nonlinear dynamics is an attempt to understand how two or more bodies will behave within a complex system, which is defined as any system that is made up of two or more interacting bodies. Erich von Holst was a German physiologist and one of the first to study patterns of coordination in both humans and animals, and in turn really pioneered the work for the dynamic pattern theory. His work focused on order parameters, or a change from one pattern to another, meaning that the complex system in question has switched over from one value of the order parameter to another. He also studied the control parameter, which is when a pattern is switched over due to an outside variable. It's important in this theory to also understand stability, which in this sense would be reflected as the ability of a pattern to resist change. In the dynamic pattern theory, there are many factors and ways in which the body and brain can receive information, psychologically, chemically or pharmaceutically, anatomically, etc. Therefore, a movement's behavior is not 100% controlled by the brain's higher centers, such as in the information processing system, but it is the product of a complex system and contains many interacting components, which is really one of the main differences between this theory and the information processing model. The last theory is the open and closed loop theory, which was one of the first theories created in the motor control world. And it is based on the realization that the brain and body's control of movement depends on both efferent information from the higher center and afferent information from your sensory receptors throughout your body. The difference between the two is that if only efferent information is available, then we would be discussing an open loop. Whereas if both afferent and efferent information is available, we are now discussing a closed loop. In open loop, the higher center is in charge of planning out the movement and sending the neurons or signals to the rest of the body and muscles to achieve a desired motion. In closed loop, on the other hand, the same process of the higher center planning movements and sending signals will occur, but there will also be a second communication of sensory feedback obtained during the movement, which is being sent back by neurons back to the higher center where the motion was originated, thus completing an entire or a closed loop. An important aspect of closed loop is that your higher center will store desired movements as a reference point and use any sensory feedback to compare it to its reference points, and in that sense make any needed adjustment as you are completing the physical activity. This theory is similar to the information processing model in the sense that the higher center is the starting point and creative director, if you will, for any movement.